Good morning, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 115 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, pursuant to Standing Order 1083C and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, February 5th, 2024. Committee is meeting to consider matters related to postal service in Canada's rural and remote communities. Reminder, please do not put earpieces next to the microphone as it causes feedback and potential injury. Colleagues, before we start, I just want to note the passing of a friend of OGGO, Mr. Jim Hobson. Mr. Hobson, Mr. Jarra was with us at the time when we were doing our cross-Canada Canada Post tour. Mr. Hobson was one of the four people who wrote the Canada Post in the Digital Age report and appeared several times with OGGO on Canada Post. Famous Saskatchewan Rough Rider as well, and helped the Rough Riders to Grey Cup. So I just want to mention his passing and let his family know we thank Mr. Hobson for his service to our committee. I'd like to welcome our witnesses today. We have Mr. Brisson and Mr. Yee. Let me express my disappointment that you chose not to be here in person in committee. I hope Canada Post and future committees will actually send people in person for us. I understand there's a 5-minute opening statement from one of you. Please go ahead. Are you muted, sir?
Thank you, Mr. President. Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to read this in French. Merci au président et aux membres.
Thank you to the chair and to committee members for inviting Canada Post to join you today. My name is Alexandre Brisson, VP of Operations Engineering, and I'm accompanied today by Michael Yee, VP of Retail and Financial Services. Before we get to your questions, I would like to share some important context for today's discussion. Canada Post is proud to serve all Canadians. We deliver almost 6.5 billion letters and parcels to nearly 17.4 million addresses in Canada. Providing postal service to all households and businesses is part of our core mandate. It is defined in the Canada Post Corporation Act of 1985, which created the postal system as we know it. We fulfill this mandate by following the service expectations set out in the Canadian Postal Service Charter, which has been in place since 2009. It is our duty to serve Canadians no matter where they live, including rural, remote, and northern communities, and we recognize that they're the ones who need us most. The service we provide to rural communities is vital. We have 3,211 post offices serving these areas. This is 633 more post offices than in urban areas. We bring mail and parcels in and out by trucks, trains, and planes. This includes more than 280 flights each week, as some areas are only accessible by air for a large portion of the year. In some places, we are the only delivery service they have. Because the cost of delivering is higher, not all companies serve rural communities. In fact, they often rely on us to make their last-mile deliveries. We remain a lifeline that connects the residents and businesses of these communities to the rest of Canada and the world. We fully understand this responsibility, and we proudly fulfill it. We have teams dedicated to maintaining service and improving it where possible. For instance, last year, we opened our second full-service post office in Iqaluit, as well as 3 full-service post offices in northern and Indigenous communities. We invested roughly $1.4 million to make improvements across our rural network. Over the past few years, we have opened 4 community hub post offices, which offer expanded services. We are also supporting dealers who provide postal services in northern and remote communities by helping to offset their higher costs. But while we are dedicated to improving services where possible, we do face challenges. For example, when a postmaster retires or leaves their position in a rural, remote, or northern community, it can be very difficult to find a replacement. Sometimes we can lose a post office for reasons beyond our control, such as a fire or a natural disaster. In this case, Finding a new suitable location can be incredibly challenging. But when this happens, we have established processes that we follow. This involves consulting with community leaders to determine how best to continue services in their area. Last year, through our community outreach process, we were able to maintain 100 rural corporate post offices in need of a new postmaster or a new location. Our guiding principle is to ensure every Canadian has access to postal service as laid out in the Canadian Postal Service Charter. But we also have to operate within our means. The reality is that mail has been in decline since 2006. Back then, we delivered almost 5.5 billion letters, and now we deliver less than half of that volume. At the same time, the number of addresses we deliver to has been growing by more than 200,000 a year, which means the cost of delivering mail keeps going up. While mail volumes declined, our parcel volumes increased, driven by online shopping. We were able to pivot and develop our parcel business. However, as Canada emerged from the pandemic, changes in the competitive delivery landscape accelerated. We're now facing intensifying competition by low-cost operators who have disrupted the parcel delivery market in just a few short years. As a result, our market share has significantly dropped. In the coming weeks, we will be releasing our annual report, which will provide more insight into the gravity of our financial situation. Though we face these significant challenges, I want to emphasize that we remain
Vous avez dépassé le temps qui vous a été imparti.
Sans problème. Nous continuerons de maintenir nos...
Of course, we will continue to maintain and invest our rural network where we can as we strive to balance our challenges across our postal system. Thank you for this opportunity to speak.
To answer your questions.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll start with Mrs. Block for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses today on the first day of this very important study, certainly for those communities in rural Canada who continue to be deeply concerned about the kind of service that they are receiving from Canada Post. I'm a member of Parliament from Saskatchewan. I represent a very large rural riding and have heard from a number of constituents and communities, actually. So Canada Post has been running fairly significant deficits for a number of years now. We've been made aware of that. In January, it was announced that Canada Post sold 2 of its businesses, Innova Post and SCI Group Incorporated, as a move towards refocusing itself on the needs of Canadians and focusing on the core business of Canada Post. Can you tell us, were either of these companies that were sold running profits, or were they also running deficits?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I certainly, when we sold those companies, it was part of our strategic plan, transformation plan, that is. Canada Post, as you know, is now operating in a very different market, so moving from a letter mail-centric company to a parcel-centric company. And that's no small transformation. So I think the committee's got to see these 2 transactions in light of that strategy to refocus, like you said, our activities on our core postal and logistics service. Certainly, SCI was a 3PL and was a profitable company. We actually, as part of our strategy, decided to sell it. And really, that's management's focus back on our own operations and activities.
So if I could stop you there, because I do have a follow-up question to that answer you've just given. Why would Canada Post sell profitable businesses that could be used to subsidize its core business?
I would say first on the financial side of this, you will see the transaction in our own financial statements, so you're going to have access to these numbers. Part of the group of company, it's very important that we're able to stay focused on our strategy. It's a question of looking at the group of companies and actually creating synergies in that group of company, and that's where our long-term transformation strategy did not involve SCI going forward, and that's critical for us. So we're able to focus on our core business, which is postal service to all Canadians.
and yet you continue to run deficits. I found a quote regarding the sale of SCI Canada Post media relations person Lisa Liu, and she stated, "It's a great company, but no longer fits the corporation's long-term strategy and growth plans, even though it's a profitable company." Can you tell us what plans or strategy forced Canada Post to sell this company? You've mentioned that it doesn't fit, but can you tell us why it didn't fit within your strategy?
Yeah, I think the question, when you think about strategy and the long-term repositioning of Canada Post, we got to look at the group of company and be clear on what synergies exist between the groups so we can actually better serve our customers and better serve Canadians. And I think from that standpoint, SCI being a warehousing 3PL company was not one of those building blocks. So it makes sense from a management standpoint to look at what we have and to refocus Canada Post on its logistics activity, which is actually serving Canadians. And that's where 100% of our focus is going forward, because that's what Canada needs us to do.
So as I mentioned, I represent a very large rural riding in the province of Saskatchewan. With the growing financial losses that Canada Post is experiencing, what are the implications for rural and remote communities that already don't receive the same level of service as urban centers?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think we cannot associate the financial challenging position that we're in against the service we provide. That's two separate things. We have a service charter that was approved in 2009, and we developed a supply chain and an operating plan to serve Canadians according to that charter. And day in, day out, and year over year, we do not modify the service we provide Canadians based on our financial position. I'm from operations, and we operate this plan every day to meet service. It's not a question of cutting back service on the back of having a tough financial time. So it's really two separate discussions, and that's where the transformation Canada Post is so critical. But we do not curb the services we provide because we're having a tough couple of years financially.
So then you're just providing a different level of service to rural Canadians because you choose to, not because you can't afford to provide a better service to rural Canadians.
The way I would say this is we have a service charter that's mandated by the government. It was approved in 2009, and we comply and abide by that service charter, and that's the way our delivery and service plan is being executed every day of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Shawari, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And let me continue on the line of questioning that my colleague, Ms. Block, started. According to a news article published by CBC this past January, Canada Post also announced it will sell its in-house IT business, InnovoPost, to Deloitte Canada. As part of the outsourcing deal, Canada Post will maintain an IT leadership team, while most of the InnovoPost 750-person workforce is absorbed by Deloitte. Canada Post chose to outsource their IT operation to reduce costs. Has this outsourcing been effective in reducing the operating costs?
Thank you for the question. I think we got to see that transaction in light of our strategy in the long term. If we look at the logistics industry,
sorry, the question was, has it reduced the operating cost?
We're in the process of going through with that transaction, so it's actually too early at this point to be able to answer that question. The transition is taking place as we speak.
So you don't know whether it would reduce the cost, but yet you made the choice, or Canada Post made the choice to outsource it?
We made the choice to go through with that deal because strategically the importance of technology for us is more and more important to run a logistics business. I think we all see and know that the importance of information now in logistics business as a consumer on tracking our parcels and all data around the goods that we order is very, very important, and we see our competition investing massively in technology. So we got to see that transaction in a strategic light.
Okay, thank you. To the moratorium that was put back in 1994 for rural and remote postal services. Did we have a definition, a clear definition of what rural meant in 1994?
Thank you for the question. I believe that, as my colleague outlined, the moratorium is a core part of the Canada Post Service Charter, which outlines our expectations around universal service. It also mandates that we must maintain convenient access to postal services. We run the largest national network of post offices, 98%
Sorry,
of
I appreciate that. All I'm asking is, did we in 1994 have a definition for rural and remote area?
So as we understand it, within the moratorium, it named, I believe, 4,000 post offices in 1994, named post offices and communities within the moratorium. So it's a named basis.
So there was no definition as it relates to, for example, amount of service or amount of population in that definition. It was just naming.
Well, from a service perspective, the service that we have to provide in all communities is defined within the service charter, as I was as we mentioned. But from a who applies within the moratorium, it's a named basis.
How does postal locations are determined to be rural without any formal guidance?
I wasn't around in 1994 when to speak specifically to how specific communities were taken. I can get back to the member with a better answer from our team. But what we abide by right now with regards to our obligations under the service charter and the moratorium, which we fully respect, is based off of the named basis within the moratorium.
So to just let you know, Richmond Hill and also Brampton was named as rural postal services, and I have one of the biggest processing in Richmond Hill. One of the largest processing centers in Canada, at least in Ontario, in my writing. So, do you consider Richmond Hill as a rural area that needs to be protected? I'm not saying we should move it. I'm just saying the definition is not there, so the guidelines are not there. So.
Right, and
how are we going to protect the areas if we don't even know what the definition is?
Right, and thank you to the member for the question. I mean, growing up in North Toronto, I also recognize that Richmond Hill is a very urbanized part of the country, and the country has frankly changed a lot, both in delivery and urbanization since 1994. The fact remains that with regards to the moratorium, we adhere to it, given that it's part of our service charter. We commit to maintaining all named communities within the post office within the confines of the service charter for service, and service is defined within that service charter.
So the fact that Richmond Hill now is a rural, does it really impact another real rural area, the services?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
If Richmond Hill with 200,000 plus residents is considered rural, how about services for somewhere that's on 5,000 members, 5,000 residents in?
Well, with regards, I would distinguish service in two regards. So one is delivery services, which my colleague can speak to on the operations side. With regards to the moratorium, which focuses specifically on whether post offices in these named communities can be converted or closed, the Richmond Hill post office, if it's on the moratorium, cannot be closed or converted, the same as Head of Jador, Nova Scotia, or other rural communities.
Thank you, sir. That is our time. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Brisson and Mr. Yee, thank you for joining us today. I do have some questions about rural and remote areas. I was lucky enough to grow up in Fairmont on the Côte-Nord, Until 1984, there were no roads. And I do remember a few interesting times when packages came quite delayed. Now, the same would be true for Kuujjuaq, Notre-Dame de Blanc-Sablon, and other areas. And I don't know if you've ever gone to these areas, but everything either it gets there by boat, and boats in Kuujjuaq have to deal with a very small window, or the items are flown in. Postal services are so deficient that people are thinking of setting up their own musher postal service. Dog sleds, in other words. So that gives you an idea of the situation. We need to get medicine in, clothes in. Something as simple as a pen. Everything has to come in through the postal service. And despite repeated calls on the part of the inhabitants and representatives, the situation has not gotten any better. And the same applies actually to the Magdalen Islands. So what kinds of solutions has Canada Post considered in order to resolve the problems of these people living in truly remote and isolated areas? And I'm not counting Fairmont anymore because we at least have a road. So what are the solutions that you want to bring forward? Thank you for the question, and I do appreciate the question. I'm from the lower St. Lawrence area, and it is true that the situation is quite different for many regions in Canada. This is a huge country, and being able to reach out to everyone is not a simple affair. It's not a simple affair on a daily basis. I've been with Canada Post for 4 years, and we have a vast network, and there are operational teams who manage on a daily basis every single connection that we have. Thank you. I'm sorry, I don't have much time, so I just want to come back to my question, and perhaps I can reformulate it. So, for example, you're considering drone deliveries. Would drone deliveries be part of the solution for areas like Kuujjuaq and others like Notre-Dame de Blanc-Sablon? Well, throughout Canada, we deliver parcels in many different ways. There are ferries, there are trains, there are planes. Now, we're always trying to keep abreast of any technological changes. You raised drones. We're currently running tests on drones. We're not ready to do parcel delivery by drones. However, we are following what's happening out there in the market. And there are companies like ourselves, like Boiler Mail. And in the United Kingdom, there are many islands that have to be served, and they're doing a lot of drone tests as well. So there is much to be done. I'm not sure how that will work to scale it up here. However, we are keeping all our options open so that we can figure out how to serve people. Well, there are solutions that were proposed for the Basse-Côte-Nord. And there were going to be parcels that were identified, for example, as being urgent. For example, diabetes medication, epilepsy medication. But despite solutions that were brought forward, it appears that some of these parcels do not get there or do not get there in time. And so we're talking about diabetes and epilepsy. So that's a question of life and death. What is being done for these people so that they receive these deliveries? So beyond words like we have a huge country, we're talking about urgency. We're talking about life and death. And these are also situations that mean people are leaving these areas, which is an added disadvantage. Yes, I understand the importance of the parcels that we deliver. That is not in question at all. It's such an important link to have. I believe that we have a well-established plan, but at the same time, we face many challenges and incidents like temperature. There's heat, and there's cold, and there's snow. So Our teams are dedicated to improving service on a daily basis and to maintaining this link so that it's as reliable as possible in all these areas of the country, including those areas that you mentioned. Thank you very much. Yes, cold and heat, snow, storms, these things exist everywhere. They have to be taken into consideration, obviously. Now, it was brought to my attention that there was a situation in Kuujjuaq where there's a wait list for mailboxes. So some people don't even have their mailboxes. What that means is that several people end up with the same mailbox or mailing address, with all that implies in terms of confidentiality. And there are francophones in Kuujjuaq who can't even get service in their own language. What are your solutions? Well, first of all, I can't necessarily answer directly to the example you raised. However, what I would say is this. We will submit this to our team, and you will get a very clear answer on that specific case, because I can't necessarily speak to the details of that myself. However, we will provide you with an answer with as much detail as possible.
The committee has passed a motion that we do require all responses back, such as the one just mentioned, within 21 days. Mr. Backrack, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Brisson and Mr. Yee, for being with us today. The committee had hoped to have the CEO of Canada Post appear as part of this study. I understand, Mr. Chair, that you've had correspondence with the CEO, and I wonder if you could update the committee on when we can expect an appearance as part of this
Yes,
study.
thanks for bringing that up. It'll be after May 3rd when it's tabled in the House, their updated report he has offered. So I suspect we'll have them in mid to late May, maybe with the estimates as well. Thanks for bringing that up.
Fantastic. Thanks for the update. This is an issue that's very, very pertinent to the area that I represent in Northwest BC, an area that is entirely made up of rural and remote communities, many of them difficult to get to. Many of them rely heavily on their postal service, as I'm sure you're well aware. And in the past couple of years, I've been involved in issues around rural post offices and the loss of rural post offices, and working with communities to try to reestablish their postal service has shed a lot of light on the shortcomings of Canada Post's model for rural postal delivery. And you mentioned, Mr. Brisson, in your earlier comments that sometimes there are situations such as the death of a postmaster or a fire that results in the loss of a post office. And in those cases, it can be challenging to find a replacement. Now, I wonder how much of that has to do with the offer that Canada Post is putting on the table. Because my understanding from talking to these communities and talking to individuals who have considered becoming the postmaster is that Canada Post offers a pittance. They require postmasters to provide their own post office, and then they pay them a ridiculous starting wage, considering that these are federal employees responsible for handling the mail, which since the beginning of mail delivery has been an occupation of great responsibility and import. So perhaps I'll start with the question of how much Canada Post offers as the starting salary, starting wage, hourly wage for a rural postmaster. What's the starting wage?
Yeah. So thank you for the question. There's no question that it is a challenge in the rural areas to be able to respond to changes in personnel, like you said. And our focus is certainly to maintain the service. Now you're talking about wages, and as you know, it's this year actually 2024 is a year of union negotiations, and we definitely table those topics, and we do discuss the condition of employment in rural areas, and that's certainly a topic dear to our hearts, and it's a topic also very important for our CPA union. It's a negotiation year. We have many topics on the table with them. Discussions are actually taking place now, and around the wages, I would not want to comment at this point in time because our labor negotiations are actually happening as we speak.
Mr. Brizon, like this is an easy question to ask, and I ask it knowing the answer. I just want to hear you say it. Now, last year, for instance, or the year before that, what was the starting hourly wage for a Canada Post postmaster in a rural community? You know the number. It's a simple question. It doesn't compromise. It's also public information, and it doesn't compromise the negotiations that you're in currently with the union. Can you share with the committee what the starting hourly wage for a rural postmaster is?
Can I turn to my colleague here? Michael,
Absolutely.
you wanna jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. And Mr. Bachrach, thank you for the question. I would like to first off say that with regards to postmasters, we recognize that the role that they play in community.
I have 1 minute left. 1 minute. So Mr. Brizon already gave a bunch of context. We're just looking for a number,
Right.
just an hourly salary, hourly wage.
And what I can say is that it actually differs depending on the community. And so to get you the most accurate information, I would actually like to follow up with you with the actual numbers, because there's a bit of there are regional discrepancies, and not discrepancies, there are regional adjustments that we make depending on where communities are for postmasters.
Okay, my understanding is that the collective agreement has a starting hourly salary, and that hourly salary is less than $20 an hour. I see you nodding, so it sounds like that's roughly in the ballpark. And to me, that's probably part of the reason that it's difficult to recruit new postmasters in communities that have lost their postmaster. The minimum wage in British Columbia as of June 1st is going to be $17.40. So Canada Post is paying just barely above minimum wage for a job that involves handling the mail. Now, my next question is around what you pay for rent, because these postmasters have to also provide the post office, and you provide a stipend for rent. Does Canada Post base that stipend on market rent for real estate in those rural communities?
So with regards to the compensation, there's wages, and then there's a stipend for real estate, as you mentioned. What I can say is we adhere to our longstanding and normal practices for postmasters in these remote communities to provide facilities where, unfortunately, sometimes there are limited options for space to provide postal services. And so, we've had this process and compensation scheme in place for many years. It's a process that we adhere to, and I know it's an active point of communication right now with the Canadian Postmasters and Assistants Association.
If I may, Mr. Chair, can I just note that the question was whether Canada Post bases the stipend on market rent in the communities where the post office is located? And Mr. Yeh, unfortunately, you didn't provide an answer. I know that the answer is no, you don't. The stipend is a pittance. And this is the reason, because you don't pay the postmasters adequately and you don't pay adequately for the space. That is the reason that Canada Post has trouble reestablishing post offices in rural communities. And I see you nodding because I know that you know that this is the case. And I hope this is something that we can get to as a committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your forbearance.
Thank you, Mr. Yee. Mr. Bachrach, over to you, Mrs. Kusi, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today.
Do you condone the stealing of mail?
I'm sorry, I don't know what document you're referring to.
It's a simple question, Mr. Bryson. Do you condone the stealing of mail? Do you think it's acceptable to steal mail?
The answer is absolutely not. So I guess so. Let me just state a few things. We take the security of mail very, very, very seriously. We have internally teams looking to ensure the security of mail. We got mail inspectors in our systems collaborating nationally at all level to make sure that we do everything we can to, one, keep the mail safe, but also make sure that we don't support any illicit activities through the services we provide. So that's a very high priority for Canada Post.
In your opinion, is a $500 fine acceptable? Is that enough of a punishment for someone who would steal mail, an individual who would steal mail? Do you think that's an acceptable punishment for the crime of stealing mail?
Yeah, I know, and I'm not close. I'm an operations person here. My job is to provide service, but I do know that I guess depending on what happened, we have I guess our teams aligned with the local officials to enforce the security of mail. So I don't know this specific case, but I know we're taking this very, very seriously across the board.
Well, sadly, Mr. Bryson, it was an elected official, someone in our very chamber. Do you think it's acceptable that a member of parliament would steal mail?
It's never acceptable for anyone to steal mail, and our job is to protect the integrity of our system.
Thank you. Mr. Bryson, how many executives at Canada Post this year earn bonuses, please?
I don't know is my answer. I'm not part of these discussions, so that's probably something I would then submit to our team for a response.
If you could get that number and report it back to the committee, that would be very much appreciated. A similar question, do you know how many executives currently work at Canada Post in the EX1 classification or higher?
I do not. I do not see this information, so I cannot answer, but we'll add that
Thank
if
you.
possible to our response.
Thank you. That would very much be appreciated. Would you have any idea as to the total amount of bonuses which have been given over the past year? If you could get that information for the committee as well, it would be very much appreciated. As well, the total amount of bonuses, the increase since 2015. If you could kindly get back to the committee with all of this information, it would be very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. We will.
Excellent. Mr. Bryson, in May of 2023, there was a report that came out regarding a report from the Privacy Commissioner of Canada indicating that Canada Post was not honoring the privacy of Canadian citizens by harvesting information from the mail and then renting it to third parties. Do you think that this is acceptable, that private information is harvested from the mail of Canadians and then rented to third parties for the profit of Canada Post? Do you think this is an acceptable use of information of Canadians?
Let me start by saying that obviously, I guess, with the evolution of our services and information technology, we all realize there's a lot of information out there. Canada Post is absolutely committed to protecting the information of all Canadians. There's no question about that. We did actually obviously receive the concern of the Office of the Commissioner, which we responded actually. The program that was in question is our ad mail marketing program. What we did from the feedback, we actually adjusted that program. So what we did, I can point to two examples. The first one is, we're managing postal codes, and we got the ability to aggregate purchase patterns at the postal code level. So from the feedback of the Office of the Commissioner, we actually stopped doing that altogether. So there's no more aggregation. We were also using public information from telephone directories that were available to augment their own set of data, and we also stopped doing that. So
thank you, sir.
And I'd say thirdly,
that is our time.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson.
Okay.
Yeah.
President.
Mr. Kusmirchuk, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Brisson, in your opening remarks, you described Canada Post as a lifeline for rural and remote communities, and I wholeheartedly agree with that characterization of the important work of Canada Post. I want to talk a little bit about the impacts of climate change on that lifeline for rural and remote communities. Last year we saw was the worst record in terms of wildfires in Canada's history. We had 17 million hectares of forest in Canada that were burned, and the majority of those took place in areas and provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick. Ironically, we had three premiers here last week or 2 weeks ago talking about climate change and the lack of any action on their parts to address climate change. but nonetheless, 17 million hectares were burned. 90% of those, in a recent analysis was conducted, 90% of those wildfires were the result of wildfires, I should say, were the result of climate change and drought conditions. And so I wanted to ask you, have you seen the impact of climate change on the work of Canada Post and the ability to continue to deliver services to rural and remote communities? And I ask that because, as I understand it, last year, over a 6-month period, there were 150 mail delivery interruptions that took place, and virtually all of the active interruptions were related to things like wildfires and floods. Can you speak to sort of the impact that severe weather events and climate change is having on service delivery to rural and remote communities?
Yeah, for sure. And I would start by saying we totally, definitely recognize that, we see more and more climate events, and we see the impact of climate change on Canada in different ways. And certainly past experiences are kind of teaching us how to respond going forward. I think forest fire last year is probably a prime example for us. I can tell you that it certainly raised internally in our operations this need to build contingency plans that actually try to preempt those events, because we're expecting to see them. I'm going to say, sadly, we're expecting to see them regularly. So the question becomes then how is it that we respond to those forest fires and floods? I think we've seen examples where I guess that the guideline for us is always like service number one, and I'd say just on the same line as the safety of our own employees. So I think that's kind of where we draw this line. We're investing tremendous amount of time on developing contingency plans and have opportunities to have temporary post offices to serve some of those areas where people actually have to move and leave their homes behind. And so I'm going to say we're not only aware and clear that we're going to have more of those in our future, but we're preparing for it. And it's forest fires, certainly on the delivery side of things, but it's floods and it's so many other things. So that's becoming part of our planning going forward because it's a reality.
Yeah, last year you had to suspend delivery service to a lot of rural and remote communities in British Columbia and Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, because of climate change and severe weather. Can you give us an example of communities where that service was suspended for long periods of time, and how quickly, on average, are those service disruptions resolved?
Yeah, and I think I'll turn to my colleague here, Michael.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And as Alex mentioned, there were a number of instances last year. The one thing that I would like to mention is that we did deploy a mobile post office. I believe it was to a community in British Columbia. I would like to get back to you on that specific community last year because of an interruption in service. We noticed that with the climate issues in Nova Scotia as well, that there could be a stronger need to have a more readily available fleet or deployable capacity.
Mr. E, can you provide the committee, can you just provide a written testimony in terms of the disruptions that took place last year, service delivery disruptions, and we want to know how long they lasted, if you can, specifically those as a result of wildfires and floods. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, and we can characterize it as appropriate. Thank you.
And maybe provide the costs as well. We now have Mrs. Vignola for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brisson, rural communities aren't necessarily remote, but they still have their own challenges. For example, they're in some rural regions where there are homes on streets with the same name, and they might have the same number and the same postal code, but they're not in the same village necessarily. And so that is a risk to security, just to name one. Because if there's a fire in one, well, and the firefighters don't go to the right address, there certainly is going to be a problem. However, it's also a problem with respect to confidentiality because there are mistakes that are made because of these addresses. Now, some solutions were proposed in areas I've been to. But what I would like to know is when are you going to find a system or implement a system in order to be able to validate the postal code for each residence and so that these inhabitants get their parcels at their address? So that, and also, of course, if there are emergencies, that the responders go to the right address. Well, that's a good question. From what I understand, here at Canada Post, we are the ones that establish postal codes throughout Canada. And we try and keep those codes as stable as possible and change them as infrequently as possible so that we're not creating confusion for the constituents. Now, there's only so much we can do because of jurisdiction. Yes, but I'm talking about addresses that have always been around, where I'm not talking about new addresses. So you're saying there is no solution? Okay, I'll move on. Mr. Yee, you used to work for McKinsey, and now your responsibilities include sales modernization, new products and services. So sales modernization and products. Can you expand on that? Give us a few more details and tell us how this modernization process will end up in better service, how it will end up in better profitability, and how you'll make sure that this won't impact staff.
You can provide that in writing to the committee. And if you're unsure of what was being asked, the clerk will clarify to you. Mr. Bachrach, please, for 2.5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was noting that in PSPC's 2023 ministerial transition binder, it indicates that the cost of shipping parcels is one of the greatest challenges facing residents of rural communities, and that aligns very much with what I'm hearing from residents in remote communities in Northwest BC. I asked my awesome team to do a little research online and figure out how much more it costs to ship stuff to remote communities, and they looked at a pair of Levi's pants cost $79.95 on Amazon, pretty common pair of pants. And of course, we all want people to support their local retail outlets. Mr. Chair, are those the pants you wear? No? I hope you stopped the clock for that. Now, a pair of Levi's, $79.95. If you ship them to Dodge and Geeds on Haida Gwaii, they cost $137.14. You ship them to Telegraph Creek, they cost $140.13. You ship them to Atlin, they cost $137.14. And I can't possibly believe that this reflects the cost that Canada Post is charging Amazon to deliver the parcels there. And I bet you anything that I, as an individual, could go to wherever that Amazon distribution center is and ship those pants using Canada Post services to those communities for a fraction of that cost. And I think what's happening is that these big companies are gouging customers in remote communities using Canada Post postal codes as a way to radically inflate the price of shipping to the point where common goods that these communities rely on are totally unaffordable to get there. And many of these communities don't have very many shopping opportunities. They don't have a lot of stores, and there are a lot of products they have to mail order. So my question is, what is Canada Post doing about this problem? And what can we do as parliamentarians to avoid residents of our communities being gouged to such a tremendous degree?
You only have about 20 seconds to answer that, I'm afraid.
Thank you for the question. I cannot comment on the strategy retailers use to sell their products. So I will not comment on that. I can comment on our pricing, what we do, and I can guarantee you we do our best to have the best fair price for the services that we provide, and that includes all of our rural deliveries. And we spend tremendous amount of time to make that price as fair as we can because we take that mission very, very seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Bryce. And Mrs. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned a long-term strategy and growth plans for Canada Post. Am I correct in stating that this would require Canada Post to submit this strategic plan to the Government of Canada for approval?
We definitely do have a long-term strategy, and we need a strategy because the competition landscape has changed greatly, and that's why we got this transformation plan. If you refer to the actual corporate plan, so we are operating under an approved corporate plan, and we actually submitted this year's plan, and we're currently in discussion with the government to move that plan forward.
So when was the last time Canada Post submitted a strategic plan that was approved by the government and allowed to be implemented?
That's a good question. I don't have the exact number of years. I definitely do know that we're submitting a plan every year, and that plan is the basis for a discussion with the government, and then we move from that.
So
I know also we're still within the limit. We're still within the limit and boundaries of the last plan that was approved. I do not recall the exact date, but that's certainly something we can answer back to the committee.
So what we're talking about is the annual plan that the board submits to the Government of Canada, correct?
The plan, as I know, being the corporate plan submitted to the government every year.
Are you aware of any strategic plans, corporate plans, that have been submitted to the government which have still not been approved or rejected? In other words, is Canada Post sort of being left in limbo because their plans are not being approved or rejected by the Government of Canada?
I'm not part of the building of the plan directly, so I know the plan submitted, and I know we're having direct discussions, and that's the extent to which I can give you information on that.
Given your role in service delivery and the impact that not having a plan approved might have on your ability to adjust the service that is being provided to Canadians, can you tell us if you've experienced any operational losses as a result of plans not being approved or rejected?
I would say what we see is from the competition. You're talking about the corporate plan. What I see from an operations standpoint is we now operate in a market that's got heavy competition. So for every parcels we move, we actually got to go for it. We got to win it. And that ability to compete is what our plan is about. So I think we all see our competition showing flexible deliveries, so delivering later in the day, delivering over the weekends, delivering over holidays, and there's a tremendous amount of competition, and it pushes us to transform the way we serve Canadians, and we would say expectations have changed. And that's why we talk about transformation plan, because the expectations have changed. We're a machine that was built for a letter mail delivery. We're now in the middle of a big parcel market, and we got to change. And that's what's at the heart of what I see from an operations standpoint and why we need to transform.
So are you finding it difficult to be nimble enough in your transformational planning, given that you have to submit a plan to the Government of Canada and they may or may not approve or reject it, leaving Canada Post in a position where they can't make change?
Yeah, I think it's more of a factor of the size of our company. We're a big company, and we got a great history behind us. But it's change, right? So the amount of change it takes to reorient the company is significant. A lot of that is on the table, actually, with our union this year, because it's a year of labor negotiations. So all this flexibility we need on the transportation side is at the heart of the transformation, and it's being reviewed and discussed as we speak. So that's very, very important for Canada Post going forward.
Thank you.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr.
Sorry, I have a colleague who's asked for my last 30 seconds, Chair.
You're at 15 seconds now, so thanks. Mr. Sousa, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. Obviously, Canada Post's, recurring financial losses are concerning in the sense that it's almost unsustainable given the net liquidity position is depleting. And I get it. We have a lot of challenges before us in regards to diminishing volumes of core mail and increasing demand for the e-commerce parcels and competitors using low-cost gig economy and contract labor and certainly compensation restrictions pose conflicts for Canada Post. And in so doing, there's a number of things that you're doing, and I appreciate some of those transformations that are undergoing. One of them is developing a long-term plan to optimize the real estate portfolio, enabling us to lower operating costs. And this includes identifying office buildings for immediate and potential disposal. I certainly recall one that was recently done in Service Canada in Belleville, and it converted 38 new homes for Indigenous peoples and women and children. And it was a great opportunity to utilize some office space that was vacant and underutilized for that purpose. Do you feel that rural moratorium, as it currently stands, in preventing Canada Post from optimizing the corporation's real property holdings in both rural and non-rural areas, do you feel that the moratorium prevents that right now?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It certainly the moratorium kind of freezes the rural world from that perspective. I would say we got properties, across Canada in so many different ways, right? Big, small, and medium. I mean, we got teams constantly going through this and trying to identify opportunities to monetize and or convert and support some of the housing crisis, certainly. And so that's always the case. That's always live. We're in the logistics business, occupying the space. The quality of our network is very, very important in our ability to serve Canadians. So for us, real estate is a prime concern. And as you know, though, like those opportunities exist. They're sometimes few and far between, but we're certainly doing our best to see what we can do in that space and trying to consider our need for expansion around the major centers.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's obviously a disparity between or given certain communities, certainly in the urban centers, a lot of air rights would be available to certain locations of Canada Post versus some others that may not have that benefit. Have any been done thus far?
I cannot answer the question, so I'll take that one back, and I'm going to ask the team to provide you an answer. I cannot give you an example.
Fair enough. In 2016, the committee tabled the report titled The Way Forward for Canada Post, and in it has 45 recommendations to improve the financial viability of the company and provide service to Canadians. One of the recommendations was to undertake a demographic analysis to ensure rural areas are truly protected and reflected in the moratorium on the closure of rural post offices. Was that demographic analysis done? And basically, I'm trying to understand if those postal codes that were protected outside of rural Canada, can you explain how that was done, or if it was done?
Can I turn to my colleague here, Michael?
Yeah, of course. 2016, I think, was before my time. But what I can say is that as we've had discussions with the government around our service charter obligations, the service charter obligations as they stand to our business now, is stated against the named moratorium basis. So, in that vein, we're aware of the rural areas and post offices that have been urbanized, but it doesn't change how we serve those communities because of our core mandate.
So you're saying that notwithstanding the locations, then, so there are some postal locations that are protected that are outside of the rural Canada. Bottom line, can you just share the findings of that analysis and then provide the committee with a copy so that we understand how that plays out?
Yeah, we can share that. We can commit to that.
Thank you.
Mr. Sousa.
Thank you, Mr. Sousa. Mr. Bryson, Mr. Yee, thank you for joining us today. We'll look forward to having President Edinger in sometime in May. Colleagues, we're going to suspend for about 4 minutes so we can bring in our new witnesses. Mr. Bryson, Mr. Yee, you're dismissed. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good afternoon. We are back in session. Gentlemen, welcome back to OGGO. I understand you're making an opening statement. Colleagues, please. We are in session. Colleagues, please go ahead with your opening statement for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and good morning. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Thank you for inviting us here today as representatives of Public Services and Procurement Canada to discuss the important topic of postal service in Canada's rural and remote communities. Joining me today is Mr. Eugene Gurwitch, who is the Director of Performance and Impact Analysis in our portfolio team. Mr. Chair, before we delve into today's topic, allow me to provide the committee with an overview of the relationship between the Department, the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, and Canada Post. Même si Post Canada relève du portefeuille du
While it is part of the Minister of Public Services and Procurement's portfolio, Canada Post is a federal crown corporation and operates at arm's length from the government. The Open and Accountable Government document, published in 2015, provides us with a framework for portfolio management in the Government of Canada, and it identifies the roles and responsibilities of ministers and their departments. This framework clearly sets out the importance of respecting the operational independence of Crown corporations while ensuring that their overall direction and policies align with those of the government. In the case of Canada Post, the Canada Post Corporation Act grants its board of directors the responsibility of directing and managing all affairs and duties of the corporation. The board consists of the president and CEO, and 10 other members, all of whom are appointed by the Governor and Council. Mr. Chair, the board is responsible for overseeing Canada Post, exercising due diligence over strategic initiatives and corporate plans, and managing services and operational performance. Responsibility for day-to-day operations is vested in Canada Post CEO, who is accountable to the board for the overall management and performance of the Crown Corporation.
Services and Procurement is accountable for providing guidance and oversight to ensure that the overall direction of Canada Post aligns with the government's policies and objectives. When it comes to reporting, Canada Post provides details of their operations and performance in their annual reports, which are tabled in Parliament by the Minister. Mr. Chair, Canada Post's mandate is to serve every Canadian address while maintaining financial self-sustainability. As is the case with other postal carriers around the world, Canada Post is evolving to meet the changing customer needs and expectations. We know that Canada Post has been experiencing financial challenges as a result of declining mail volumes for some time. The corporation continues to explore opportunities to improve the financial sustainability of its operations. As for the study at hand, the moratorium on the closure of rural post offices has been in place since 1994 and has remained unchanged despite shifts in the country's demographics. The Canadian Postal Service Charter clearly states that ensuring postal services in rural settings remains an integral part of Canada Post's commitment to universal service, and the Charter maintains the 1994 rural moratorium. Mr. Chair, as stated in the Minister's mandate letter, the government expects Canada Post to provide high-quality service at a reasonable price and that better reaches Canadians in rural and remote areas. This includes meeting the provisions laid out in its charter. Canada Post reports to the government on its performance against its charter commitments within its annual reports. Although the moratorium protects rural post offices from closure, it should be noted that there are situations that can arise that affect the ongoing operations of any post office. These situations can include personnel retirement, illness, or a fire, for example, and when they happen, Canada Post is responsible for consulting with the community to find solutions so that they can continue to provide quality services. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, as I've stated, Canada Post operates at arm's length from the government and is ultimately accountable for the conduct of its affairs. Nonetheless, PSPC supports the Minister to ensure the Crown Corporation's direction reflects government policy objectives and advises the Minister on matters under his responsibility and authority. While the Department does not have direct authority over Crown corporations, we do play a role in promoting appropriate policy coordination and building coherence in the activities and reportings of the corporations. I would be pleased to answer questions this committee may have on the role of Public Services and Procurement Canada in relation to Canada Post. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Genuis, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague in a moment, but I have a notice of motion that I want to share with the committee prior to doing that. Canadians have been shocked by the Arrive Scam scandal. Globe and Mail reports over the weekend dig further into another shocking aspect of this scandal, and that is the apparent rampant abuse of the Indigenous procurement set-aside in ways that do not benefit Indigenous peoples or communities. The Globe and Mail highlighted how various Indigenous leaders have raised significant concern about these abuses, and yet there has been a lack of action. Recognizing the need to get to the bottom of how dollars that should have been benefiting Indigenous communities across Canada were actually flowing to a small number of well-connected insiders, I'd like to propose, I'd like to put on notice the following motion, which we'll then be discussing at a later date. The motion is that pursuant to Standing Orders 108, 1, 2, and 3C, a subcommittee on government operations and Indigenous reconciliation be established to inquire into matters relating to Indigenous procurement policies, as well as other aspects of the committee's mandate, which the committee may refer from time to time relating to Indigenous reconciliation, provided that A, the subcommittee be composed of 7 members, of which 3 shall be from the government party, 2 shall be from the official opposition, 1 from the Bloc Québécois, and 1 from the New Democratic Party, to be named by the whips, informing the clerk of committee with the first members named within 1 week of the adoption of this motion. B, the subcommittee be chaired by a member representing the official opposition to be chosen by the subcommittee. C, the subcommittee shall have the same powers of the committee except the power to report directly to the House, the power to sit during a time when the committee is sitting in Ottawa, and the power to sit on days when the House is sitting. And D, when the subcommittee adopts any report, it shall be deemed to have been adopted by the committee. Dissenting or supplementary opinions shall be filed within 7 days of the adoption of the report unless the subcommittee provides for a longer amount of time, and the chair of the committee shall be instructed to present it to the House on behalf of the committee. And E, the chair of the subcommittee may, if not already a member, attend meetings of the subcommittee on agenda and procedure in a non-voting capacity. Thank you, Chair. I'll turn my time over to Ms. Block.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. In the 2021 mandate letter for the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, the Prime Minister tasked the Minister with ensuring that Canada Post provides high-quality service at a reasonable price for rural Canadians. You yourself made note of that in your opening comments. He also stated that the Minister of Rural Economic Development would assist PSPC in this matter. Are you aware of any discussions, conversations, or assistance from the Minister of Rural Economic Development or their department that has been made available to PSPC for improving Canada Post's service to rural Canada?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. While I can't speak to the ministerial level, at the officials level, we have been having conversations with a number of other departments and agencies, including colleagues from the rural area, to be able to explore options that may be available in terms of or generating ideas that might be considered by Canada Post in terms of moving forward, dealing with some of the challenges that have been discussed during today's appearance.
Okay, thank you. You also mentioned the act under which Canada Post operates and the mandate to provide postal services to all Canadians in a secure and financially self-sustaining manner. One of the representatives from Canada Post themselves made the observation that oftentimes the need to provide secure and a quality postal service often is hard to do when they have to remain within their means. Therefore, Canada Post is running at a deficit. Can you provide me with any sort of an indication as to what plans have been put in place to ensure that an effective postal service continues or will resume in rural Canada while maintaining a viable postal service to Canadians?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So two things that I would say on in this regard. First is, of course, Canada Post as an independent crown corporation and one of the largest organizations within Canada with nearly 70,000 employees from coast to coast to coast, maintains and obviously they are the specialists in the area of how they manage their own operations. As was indicated by the Canada Post reps this morning, they have a number of activities that they undertake, including the day-to-day operations. And obviously, as was noted, there are nonetheless challenges associated with that, which my conversations with Canada Post have noted that when you're dealing with that many employees in more than nearly 5,600 locations, there's bound to be some challenges that will accrue. The second thing is with regards to activities, Canada Post is obviously always looking to be able to find ways to be able to maintain its financial self-sustainability. They are a crown corporation that with one small exception, one exception of $22.6 million. I don't want to make it sound like that's not a lot of money, but they only finance their activities through revenues that they generate. I apologize.
Thank you very much. Ms. Outwin, go ahead, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our officials for being with us today. According to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement's 2023 transition binder, the Minister provides Canada Post with guidance and oversight to ensure that the overall direction and performance of the corporation aligns with the government's policies and objectives, and this is normally communicated via an annual letter of expectation. What were the major issues communicated in the Minister's latest letter of expectation to Canada Post, and what, if anything, did this letter of expectation convey on the subject of service to rural and remote areas?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So the letter of expectation is provided on an annual basis by the minister to heads of crown corporate or any minister to heads of crown corporations within their portfolio. With regards to Canada Post, the letter of expectation identified a number of expectations, and I would say that expectations fall kind of within a couple of different categories, if you'll permit. First is for all crown corporations, there's expectations of certain things that are usually issued by the Privy Council Office or government writ large. And then with regards to Canada Post, obviously there was focus on a number of activities, including those that were mentioned in the minister's mandate letter. So making sure that they're financially self-sustainable, that they provide universal services, and so on.
And can you highlight anything specific around rural and remote areas?
I can add. Oh, sorry. Am I good? Yes. The letter specifically indicated that Canada Post was expected to continue to meet the expectations of the service charter, and that it was the role of the board of directors to hold management to account to that effect.
Okay. I'm a rural New Brunswicker, so this is certainly an issue that is important to me. According to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement's transition binder again, the department is working closely with Canada Post to examine opportunities to improve the financial sustainability of its important operations. So what actions is the department considering to improve Canada Post's financial sustainability?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So again, the department has undertaken a number of activities, including, as I mentioned before, speaking with other departments and agencies in terms of whether there may be opportunities for synergies, for example, of activities between Canada Post and other federal organizations, as well as kind of encouraging Canada Post to be able to look at alternative activities when it comes to maintaining financial viability. As was noted by Canada Post representatives in the when they appeared, their primary raison d'etre is to be able to deliver letter mail. Letter mail has been in decline since 2006, with fairly important and significant reductions in letter mail as Canadians send letters less and less. As was noted, they are putting more of a focus on the parcel delivery side of it for obvious reasons, because that is seen as a bit of a growing market. So we've been working with Canada Post to try to provide some ideas or suggestions and work with them in terms of potential way forward.
Great, thank you. And are you familiar with the community hubs model for Canada Post? And so I noticed there was a newer one in Member 2, Nova Scotia. It was particularly interesting for me because it's with an Indigenous community. So there's things like parcel lockers, EV charging, financial services with an ATM on site, check cashing. Do you know of any plans to expand the community hubs throughout Canada? Perhaps this could actually address some of the concerns we have for rural communities?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. So community hubs, Canada Post undertook a number of them on a pilot basis in order to be able to see kind of, one, whether they bring benefits to the local communities, including Indigenous communities, and two, also to be able to test out their business model in terms of what are the costs of being able to operate these hubs and whether they provide a different level of revenue or return on investment than what a traditional post office would be. I know that analysis continues to be ongoing, so I don't know whether there's been a decision in terms of going forward, but it is something that Canada Post has been exploring.
Great. I'm also interested in a question that was asked in the previous panel with regards to, property portfolios and kind of, the potential for maybe addressing housing concerns or other issues in community. So what is Canada Post doing to optimize its real property portfolio, and how is PSBC supporting them in this work?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So obviously, the issue of housing is one that I think has generated a lot of attention, and within that context, all federal departments and agencies are looking to see what they can do to be able to help advance housing. In that context, we have been having conversations with Canada Post to see whether or not there may be opportunities in terms of some of their portfolio, in terms of whether that could be leveraged for housing. Recognizing, of course, that Canada Post is an operational organization in nature, a lot of the facilities that they have, they will continue to need going forward in terms of things like sorting facilities and so on, and that a lot of locations are for actual postal offices. So while there's a question in terms of how much of that could be leveraged for housing, I think it's probably good exercise to be able to review from a Canada Post perspective whether there's opportunities to do so, if there is, without having a significant impact in terms of the number of locations that there are or the spread of the locations. Of course, that could also potentially reduce its footprint, which may have cost implications.
Great, thank you. I think I have one more question, enough time for one. When discussing the future of Canada Post, are there international comparisons we can look to when it comes to revitalizing a national postal service or improving rural postal service in particular?
You have like 20 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in the 16 seconds that are left, we do take a look at the top 12 or 15 other comparable countries. Their post offices are all facing the same challenges as Canada Post, so we're learning from them.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vignola for 6, please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. Mr. Gorovich, I believe you were the one who responded to a question put by my colleague about the letter of expectation and what it contained. You said that the government expects Canada Post to meet all the charter expectations. So we're talking about the Postal Service protocol. Now, that dates back to 2018, and it was supposed to be reassessed in 2023. Now, unless I have lost some of my intellectual abilities, I could not find this new protocol or assessment. When will it come out, please? Thank you very much for the question, Chair. The protocol that you are referring to is reviewed every 5 years, and over the past year, we have reviewed this protocol. The review continues, and as you noted, perhaps during some of Canada Post's answers, this protocol hasn't changed since 2009. And so the services that need to provide obviously have not changed, but have been modified in ways. Yes, there are expectations in terms of obligations and delivery. However, that sustainability is not there. You said earlier that in order to improve financial self-sustainability, some measures had been put in place, but we don't have the list of those measures, and that there had to be a certain synergy of services throughout Canada. There also have to be more services and attempts to improve profitability. So do you have a more specific list on how you're going to, or how sustainability, financial self-sustainability is going to be ensured? The only amount that Canada Post receives from the government is that $22 million, which is basically the cost of our free parliamentary mail and the fact that any constituent can write their MP without having to pay for it. So there's $22 million approximately that covers that cost. However, we all know that Canada Post has to be modernized. But in order to be able to do that, money is required. But Canada Post is posting a loss. So it can't modernize. And if it doesn't modernize, it can't make any money. So it's really chasing its own tail. So does the government not have a role to play in order to be able to support and sustain this Crown Corporation so that it's sustainable and modern, even if that implies financial support in order to support that modernization that will help make it sustainable? Thank you very much for the question. So to your first question about the activities in more detail, I would say two things. I need to respect the independence of Canada Post. They mentioned that there will be their annual report coming out over the next 3 weeks. And in that report, you will see information on the activities they're undertaken and on their financial situation. In terms of your second question, yes, there are those $22 million out of $7 billion, actually. Now, does the organization need money? Well, as a Crown Corporation, the government will provide support where, for example, those corporations are not able to support themselves. However, what kinds of options are there to ensure that self-sustainability, given the current model? There are costs associated with making deliveries throughout the country. And obviously, that will have to be taken into consideration to determine the path forward. Well, modernization is important, and it would help ensure, for example, security and safety in certain areas. Earlier, I mentioned, for example, Courgeouat and Blanc-Sablon, where medication has to be able to arrive on time. And some areas are rural, they aren't necessarily remote, but there are duplicate addresses and postal codes, which means that that type of security is not assured. They don't receive their medication on time, for example. It would be unfortunate if these committees decided to, for example, take legal action because they are not getting what the protocols and legislation require. How can you ensure that this won't happen and that people are safe? Thank you very much for the question. 20 seconds then. Well, the board of directors have that responsibility to ensure that the organization is compliant with the expectations in place. And that's a part of the conversations we'll be having with Canada Post going forward.
Mr. Bachrach, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us. Does monitoring the effectiveness of the 1994 moratorium on post offices closures fall within the mandate of Public Services and Procurement Canada?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So the adherence to the rural moratorium is part of the service charter, and Canada Post provides updates in terms of its compliance with the service charter on an annual basis to the minister through its annual reports. And in that regard, my team and I take a look at the annual report and provide a secondary view for consideration by the minister.
So you do monitor. This is a government mandate, and you're the government, and you monitor whether Canada Post as an arm's length corporation is fulfilling the mandate. I take that as your answer. How many post offices have closed since the 1994 moratorium was put in place?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So there's been a Go ahead.
So when the moratorium was established, there was roughly 4,000 protected offices. Today there are roughly 3,400.
3,400. So 600 post offices have closed since, from that list of 4,000, we've lost 600 post offices.
Over 30 years.
Okay. And does PSPC or the government in general see this as being a problem? Like there's a moratorium on closing post offices, and yet we've seen a significant percentage of the protected list closed. Has the minister, provided any direction to Canada Post to reverse this trend? It feels like the moratorium isn't working. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
I would say that on an annual basis, roughly 125 offices come up for review, and out of that, only a small number are closed. So in 99% plus of situations, the moratorium is maintained. But absolutely, we take your point that the number of offices has continued to decline, as letter mail does continue to decline as well.
So here's my observation as someone who represents rural and remote communities. You have Canada Post post offices in rural areas. Something happens to the post office. The postmaster quits, postmaster passes away, the building burns down. Canada Post's offer to new postmasters is frankly not adequate to attract new people to the role. And so when they don't get any applicants, they end up contracting out the service. So the retail franchise model, they get a business, they pay the business a commission on parcels. And when that fails, because the commission that Canada Post pays isn't adequate, the community ends up with a steel mailbox on the side of the road. Does that ring true? Is that what we're seeing in rural Canada right now?
Thank you. So thank you, Mr. President, for the question. Recognizing that rural Canada over the last 30 years has changed fairly importantly, one of the things that was noted was that some communities that were rural 30 years ago are no longer. Gatineau is actually still on the list as a rural community. I don't know that many would consider Gatineau to be rural. So I think it's difficult to paint a brush across for all of them. What I would say is this. There are certain instances where because of demographic shifts, there are going to be closures and there are going to be openings that will obviously kind of align in terms of as Canadians continue to move throughout the country, that those would be okay. Where there's issues, obviously, is where in certain locations there's still a need for it and that the replacement is challenging.
If I could, we're talking about 600 post offices, and I'm trying to understand the trend. Those 600 post offices are not in communities that are, urbanized. Like what we're seeing is the loss of post offices in tiny communities. I know we are, like we are, right? This is the trend that we're seeing across Canada. And the question is, that's clearly contrary to Canada Post's mandate to provide better service in rural communities and remote communities. And so we have a situation where the government's mandate is not being fulfilled by the corporation. Is that not the case? The government tells Canada Post, you need to improve and deliver high quality postal service in rural and remote Canada. And Canada Post operates in such a way that we lose 600 post offices since 1994. And rural Canada is losing postal service every single year. How is that not a problem?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So obviously that is a challenge in terms of the number of post offices, including from the moratorium that have closed, as you indicated, 600 over the course of the last 3 years. So as part of that, those are the things that are kind of explored through our conversations with Canada Post in terms of raising those as challenges and areas that they need to be able to focus their attention on in terms of making sure that they're maintaining service to rural Canadians. Depending on how much time I have left, sir.
45 seconds.
So very quickly, for ministers of the Crown, there are a number of options that are available to them in terms of, their dialogues in terms of Crown corporations. We talked about the letter of expectations as being one. The other one as well is, obviously just encouragement, which is what we do within PSPC when we speak with Canada Post. And then again, making sure that the board of directors is aware of their obligations and making in terms of service delivery.
So to be very clear, has the minister ever, in the letter of expectation, expressed to Canada Post any concern about the closure of rural post offices, this loss of 600 post offices, and said, as minister, I want Canada Post to do things differently to prevent this, to reverse this trend of losing post offices? You mentioned the letter of expectation, but what you read back to us from the letter of expectation was boilerplate. It was, continue to fulfill the service mandate, blah, blah, blah. Has the minister ever expressed concern that the moratorium is not being heeded by the Crown Corporation?
Thank you, Mr. President. In the brief time that I have left, the letter of expectation sets the expectations in terms of the board. So obviously, typically tends to have language which is fairly, strategic or policy in nature.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Kusi, please, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. In the previous hour, we were able to obtain executives here from Canada Post. Unfortunately, we did not have the CEO of Canada Post today. We look forward to their testimony at a later date. But in this first hour, I questioned the Vice President of Operations relative to a May 2023 report on the invasion of privacy of Canadians, their privacy of Canadians not being respected. In this May 2023 report of the Privacy Commissioner, he indicated that information from mail was being harvested from Canadians and then rented to third-party organizations for the profit of Canada Post. Now, Canada Post, in their initial response, indicated that they did not view their engagement in these activities as being any way contrary to the public good. In fact, they said, research indicates that consumers enjoy receiving this information by mail. Well, I do not believe that Canadians appreciate having their privacy rights taken away from them. So essentially, Canada Post refused and rejected this report and recommendation of the Privacy Commissioner. Now, today, the Vice President of Operations indicated that there were some remedial measures being taken, evaluation of postal codes, etc. First of all, I would like to know, do you condone the privacy of Canadians being compromised in this fashion? Secondly, are you aware of these mitigatory steps that the Vice President of Operations of Canada Post says that have been taken? And third, do you think that's satisfactory to respect and protect the privacy of Canadians? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. So in terms of the issue of privacy, obviously the Privacy Commissioner has issued a report to Canada Post that highlighted concerns and highlighted recommendations. In terms of whether, and as was indicated today, Canada Post has undertaken activities and steps to be able to address the recommendations of the Privacy Commissioner. In terms of whether or not those are satisfactory, that would be for the Privacy Commissioner to be able to determine whether the recommendations and the steps that have been taken by Canada Post will address the concerns that were raised in that report.
I just wanted to add that in the annual letter of expectations issued to Canada Post, the expectation to meet the recommendations from the Privacy Commissioner were also included.
Excellent. So then you're saying you do respect the decisions made by independent officers of Parliament. Excellent. Another issue that we have seen this committee seized with is the issue of bait and switch in the Arrive scandal, Arrive scam, as it's now commonly known. In this process, what happens is that a contractor, a vendor enters with a certain proposal using certain subcontractors, certain other partner vendors, and then when the contract is awarded, it switches out the vendor, switches out the agreements on which the contract was awarded. What analysis has your department done to avoid the bait and switch?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. In terms of work with Canada Post on issues of their contracting activities?
I'm talking across government.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. Unfortunately, I was prepared to speak about Canada Post today. So while I know the department has undertaken a number of activities in the area of procurement, and I don't know that I would be well positioned to be able to provide an informed response.
In your role in Public Works, would you say that there is a culture of non-compliance with contractors and subcontractors because of the overly relaxed attitude of the department to accept bait and switch? I think that falls within the realm of what we're talking about today, the general culture of the department, relative not only to Canada Post, but to your department itself.
Thank you, Mr. President. With regards to my role as the Assistant Deputy Minister for Policy Planning and Communications, what I would say is what I've observed being with the department since 2018 is that it is a department that is aware of the fact that there are a number of obligations and requirements in terms of not just procurement, but a number of other areas. We've talked about privacy and others, and undertakes to the best of its abilities the work in a way that is compliant with all those rules, directives, regulations, laws.
Thank you for your testimony today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mrs. Cusi. Mr. Baines, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our department officials for joining us today. I wanted to ask Mr. Rachi, considering you're in planning and communications, and we've spoken about the annual letter that's shared with PSPC. Do you think that's sufficient, considering the rapid changes in letter mail and how mail is delivered? Is the annual letter sufficient, or is there any more periodic communication that's happening between Canada Post and PSPC?
Thank you, Mr. President, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So, response in two parts. Part one is, so again, recognizing that Canada Post is one of the largest organizations in Canada with nearly 70,000 employees across 5,600 locations from coast to coast to coast. We do have regular touch points and meetings with them on a bi-weekly basis, or sometimes even on a weekly basis, to be able to discuss the numerous issues and opportunities that Canada Post is facing. The second point is, to your first question, you talked about the letter of expectations. That is one of the tools that is used by ministers to be able to, as I mentioned before, to be able to identify expectations of Crown corporations. That's not unique to Canada Post. That's across all Crown corporations. And there are other mechanisms that are also used. Last thing that I will say, if you'll permit, is we noted very briefly before that a number of other jurisdictions, when we explore them or when we look at them, are facing similar challenges that Canada Post is facing, whether it's in the United States, in Australia, in England, France, so on and so forth. There is a decline in letter mail that's happening across the board, and a lot of all postal services basically around the world are facing similar challenges to decreasing letter mail, which results in decreasing revenues with increasing number of points at which they have to be able to deliver, which raises some fundamental concerns. Many other jurisdictions have taken the route of providing financial assistance to their postal services or postal carriers. Some of the other organizations or some of the other jurisdictions, are doing a few things that are a little bit different. And for members as part of the study that might be of interest, might want to be interested in what the Australia are doing with their postal system.
Well, considering that you're aware of the recent trends in letter mail, you're looking at other jurisdictions, what are you learning from them? So apart from the fact that understanding that they are having similar challenges, what are you learning, and what's a good model? You just mentioned Australia. What are they doing? So, and it's a comparable. It's a pretty vast, country and a region. Hard to get to certain areas similar to what we have here.
So two things, and then I'll turn to my colleague Eugene in just a second. So I think from what we're learning perspective is, particularly when we take a look at the Australian model, and as you indicated, there are a lot of comparables between Australia and Canada in terms of geography and some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that arises. I think what we're finding is that it's actually a fairly complex issue that often brings a lot of different factors into consideration in terms of things like universality, making sure that everybody in the country is treated the same in terms of service delivery. That has implications in terms of cost, in terms of there's simply some places might be a little bit easier to be able to deliver, which usually means that it's a little bit less costly to be able to do so. So what I would say is, as the committee looks at this subject, there's a fair amount of complexity in terms of some of these issues that I think we're learning about. Eugene?
Yeah, what I'll add is that posts across the world were provided an exclusive privilege, a monopoly to deliver letter mail, and as letter mail continues to decline, that source of funding will be insufficient to maintain the universal service that exists today. So as Post transition from a message-based delivery system to one that's focused on goods, on logistics, on parcels, we need to ask ourselves as a government, what does universal service mean today? Many other countries are moving to things like alternate day delivery of letter mail, while others, like Lorenzo mentioned, have decided to subsidize their national posts. So out of the roughly 192 member countries of the Universal Postal Union, which is the UN technical agency for the post, more than half today provide subsidies to their posts in one way or another to ensure that they can maintain the universal service.
I know it was mentioned earlier. I fortunately live in Richmond, British Columbia, Gateway City. A lot of access, a lot of logistics there. But we have a community hub model there actually for parcel delivery, where the Canada Post Office is inside Canadian Tire, and it's commonly lined up. People are using it. It seems to be working pretty well. So, like, is that working? Is that community hub model working?
I'm afraid we don't have time for a response, but maybe you can put that in writing. And I think Ms. Atwin had broached that as well. Mrs. Vignola, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Yarachi, you said in your opening remarks that PSPC provided advice as well as oversight. Now, in terms of advice, has any of that dealt with, for example, outsourcing, contracting out, for example, or have you not gone as far as that in your advice? Thank you very much, Chair, for the question. With respect to the daily operations of Canada Post, they are responsible for that. And I would add that Canada Post, as a Crown Corporation, and in relation to supply, given that they fall under the Act, is not subject to all the Treasury Board, for example, policies. They are independent or at arm's length in terms of their activities. Thank you. Well, we're obviously reading each other's minds, because I was looking at what has been written about Australia, for example, and the UK in terms of their postal services and their delays. Some are suffering delays up to 4 months, for example, in the UK, and in Scandinavia, it takes less than 2 weeks to receive their parcel. A parcel sent from here, and that's excellent. That's even faster than within Quebec. Sometimes when I send something to my sister, it takes more than 2 weeks. So definitely more can be done. Now, in terms of PSPC, do you, or in collaboration with Canada Post, do any more in-depth studies? Because I have the impression that everyone's going through the same thing. Fine. However, I'm getting the impression also that that's an excuse not to move forward. And it's unfortunate, because perhaps what should be said is, right, there's a problem. Yes, there are solutions. Yes, it will cost more money, but it's going to be worth it in the long term. So is there that kind of thinking going on right now? Thank you very much for the question. In 15 seconds, I would say, as I mentioned, Canada Post has about 70,000 employees. We have about 12 in our team, and we're responsible for these Crown corporations. Canada Post isn't the only one. So obviously we do the work that we can in terms of identifying ideas and potential solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to pick up where I left off with the loss of rural post offices and this trend that we're seeing where post offices go from Canada Post post offices to a contracted out service to a mailbox on the side of the road. And I was talking to Carmen McPhee. She's the chief counselor of the Tahltan Band, one of the bands of the Tahltan Nation up in northern BC. And some years ago, Canada Post contracted out the post office in Dease Lake to the Tahltan Band, and they've been running it as a service to the community. It's not working out because the amount that Canada Post is willing to pay through that contract is not enough to cover the cost of operating the post office. And so the band is losing tens of thousands of dollars per year. And when I talked to Chief McPhee, her desire was for Canada Post to take it back and to reestablish a proper Canada Post post office in that community. Now, based on your knowledge, when you look across Canada and you see the loss of all these post offices, are we seeing any examples where contracted out services, these retail franchises, go back to the Canada Post post office model with a unionized postmaster and the costs covered by Canada Post? Is that something that we're seeing? Is there a mechanism to return full services to communities where the contracted out model isn't working? Or is this sort of a one-way trip to a community mailbox on the side of the road at -40 with 2 feet of snow and no way to buy stamps? What's your message for Chief McPhee?
Thank you, Mr. President, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So, two things. First is to answer your direct question in terms of whether the contracted out model, whether we're seeing kind of the flow go the other way. I don't have the answer to that question. As I indicated, Canada Post, as an independent crown, kind of manages its own operations. I would say that in a lot of instances, so recognizing that the situation that you've described in Dease Lake is going to be very different from a lot of other franchise locations. In other instances, what Canada Post will do is there are times when they will set up a franchise location. Somebody mentioned a Walmart or a Shoppers Drug Mart, one of those retail places. Again, recognizing that in some communities that will not work for obvious reasons, but in a number of others that does tend to work. And Canadians have indicated through public opinion research that whether it's a corporate location or a franchise location, they just want to be able to have access to the service.
There's no Walmart.
And which is why I said...
There's no Shoppers Drug Mart. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. That is our time. Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to revisit the charter or the Canada Post Corporation Act and the second provision. The provision of postal services to rural regions of the country is an integral part of Canada Post's universal service. So if it's an integral part of Canada Post universal service and it is actually identified in the Act as being so, I want to go back to this whole conversation we've had around the moratoriums. Earlier in this meeting, we heard from Mr. Yee, who stated that if a post office is on the list, it won't be closed. And you yourself, Mr. Gorovich, stated that the moratorium has remained unchanged. And I have to believe that what you meant was the language of the moratorium, not necessarily the fact that we continue to see closures in rural Canada. So my question to you is, in regards to the moratorium, and as my colleague has pointed out, whether Canada Post is unable to find a retail space to host a post office, or a postmaster passes away or leaves that post and you are unable to find a replacement, it would appear that the closing of post offices by attrition is a way for the Government of Canada to subvert the moratorium. Is there any, are there any actions being taken by your department to ensure that that gap within the moratorium is closed?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So again, as we indicated, we do work with Canada Post, and we do basically point out to them or flag to them every time we become aware of a situation where a rural post office or location is at risk. Again, keeping in mind that the Crown Corporation is independent and is responsible to be able to manage its operations, and that the Board of Directors is ultimately the ones who kind of undertake the review and ensuring compliance with all these obligations of Canada Post management. We do kind of flag those, but obviously, given the numbers that we were provided or that we mentioned today of decrease of 600 locations over the course of 30 years, there are instances where locations are closing, unfortunately.
And I guess my question really, or my observation would be that the Government of Canada, the Department of Public Services and Procurement, who function under the Canada Post Corporation Act and are responsible for overseeing that act, really need to take a look at the act and the fact that we've identified that the provision of these postal services in rural Canada is an integral part of a universal service. I currently have a community, I'm the member of parliament in a large rural community, as I think I've stated. I have a community that is operating a Canada Post office out of a community hall, and they are fundraising in order to cover the costs of that service in their community. I think that's reprehensible when we're talking about a service that is supposed to be universally accessible. I will leave that one there. The Minister of Public Services and Procurement is expected to provide Canada Post with guidance and oversight to ensure that the overall direction and performance of the corporation aligns with the government's policies and objectives. And I know that this is normally communicated via a letter of expectation. I think we've spoken about that as well. Did the Minister provide Canada Post with this annual letter this year?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Yes, the Minister did.
You've already answered that the privacy of Canadians was addressed in that letter. What other major issues were identified in the letter by the Minister?
As I indicated, there's a number of areas that have been identified, including guidance that we received from the Privy Council Office.
There were some announcements in Budget 2023 dealing with spending reductions that are expected to be also reflected in Crown corporations. There was language around the need to meet the service charter. And I'll add that in addition to the rural moratorium, the service charter does include expectations that 98% of Canadians are within 15 kilometers of a post office, 88% of Canadians are within 5 kilometers of a post office, and 78% of Canadians are within 2.5 kilometers of a post office. So the rules are not just simply the moratorium on the closures, but there is also the need to ensure that there's convenient access. As MP Bachrach mentioned, there is certainly an opportunity to look at the confines of what exists currently in the rural moratorium, and examine potential changes as part of the government service charter review that needs to occur, and look at ways to ensure that services are protected in rural communities by looking at things as simple as...
Thank you very much. That is our time. Mr. Kuzmirchuk, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before I just begin my questions, I just want to ask Mr. Chair, when the premiers had appeared before the OGGO committee, we asked them to share with the committee correspondence that they had with the committee prior to their appearance. And I just wanted to get an update whether that correspondence has been shared.
Does anything come in?
I'm just wondering whether we could maybe send a reminder for that information to be sent to the committee.
Sure. We'll also check with Mr. Bigelow. As I mentioned, we have a sub-in chair today.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Thank you. Last year, thank you very much, gentlemen, for appearing at this committee, and thank you so much for the information that you're providing. Last year in IMO, as I understand it, we had Canada Post unveiled its first all-electric fleet. I think there was 14 all-electric, 100% electric delivery vans that were unveiled. This is part of our greening government strategy to electrify 14,000 of the fleet, the Canada Post fleet. I just wanted to ask whether there's been any analysis done on the potential cost savings to Canada Post of transitioning from combustion engines, fossil fuel engines, to electric vehicle fleets. Do you anticipate cost savings? I mean, it's 14,000 vehicles. We know that electric vehicles cost less to maintain. We know the fuel costs are less as well, too. Do we expect savings for Canada Post as a result of this transition to electric vehicles? And I believe that we've committed over $1 billion just for Canada Post to that transition, if I'm not mistaken. Can you please maybe speak to that a little bit?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So I know that Canada Post is exploring and doing analysis in terms of potentially electrifying its fleet. Again, recognizing that Canada Post has locations across Canada, and so in certain instances or in certain locations, an electrification of its vehicle fleet may be a little bit easier and may result in cost savings compared to others where it might be a little bit more difficult or challenging from a infrastructure perspective. I do know that this is one of the things that Canada Post is looking at as part of its ongoing assessment of its ongoing costs and whether there may be opportunities to be able to reduce some of those costs. Again, recognizing that the electrification of a fleet would obviously happen as kind of this fleet, the current fleet reaches end of its useful life cycle, which for every vehicle will obviously be slightly different. So I don't have a specific answer in terms of the number of what could be cost savings, but I do know that Canada Post is exploring that at this point in time.
Okay, if you do have that information, if you're able to share it with the committee subsequently, that would be terrific. I'd love to be able to see if there is a cost analysis for the potential cost savings of going to electric. I also wanted to ask whether right now the rollout of EVs would be taking place in urban areas where there is infrastructure, charging stations and whatnot, and communities are in close proximity. Do you foresee challenges specific to rural delivery for going to electric vehicles?
Mr. Chair, for the question. So recognizing I'm adventuring into an area that I'm really not that familiar with, so I'm going to be fairly cautious in terms of my voice because this is, again, an operational question for Canada Post. I think one of the challenges that is faced, and I'm not an EV expert, so I hope Canadians won't get upset with me if I get some of this wrong, but okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, for example, in northern communities where the temperature can get a little bit more difficult, we know the battery life can have some challenges. So I think, again, recognizing that the Canada Post has 5,600 locations spread out across Canada and that they serve many different types of communities, I don't necessarily know that a one-size-fits-all approach will work in terms of the way that they manage their fleet. They'd have to be able to target that in a way that would be appropriate to be able to both have the cost associated with it, but also the return on investment potentially.
You've been before this committee as the head of the Office of Small and Medium Enterprises before. And I just wanted to ask, is the universality principle of Canada Post, is it, in your opinion, an advantage for small businesses in Canada? Can be seen as an advantage to have this network and this service for small businesses in Canada, just from your prior role and prior perspective?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Yeah, recognizing I have been with the Office of Small and Medium, it's now called Procurement Assistance Canada, pardon me. I've been with Procurement Assistance Canada for a number of years now. So I think there is an advantage. Small businesses, particularly depending on where they're located, may have different options that are available to them in terms of shipping, particularly business-to-business shipping, but in some instances may be reliant on Canada Post. So obviously being able to have access to Canada Post in terms of being able to move their goods and services, and we heard some examples where in the past where that might not be working kind of as intended. So obviously there is a benefit in terms of your universality. And again, as I mentioned, as part of the study, the committee might be interested in taking a look at what Australia has been doing, because again, they face some of the similar challenges in terms of population and geography as we do here in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thanks for being with us. I'm glad Mr. Kuzmierczuk gave you a chance to mention Procurement Assistance Canada. For anyone, the 3 or 4 people watching on Parview right now, it is a phenomenal program within the Government of Canada. We've used it lots in Edmonton West. I strongly suggest anyone with small businesses looking to bid on Canadian business to look at their website. Highly recommended. Colleagues, just quickly, Wednesday, you will receive a email from the clerk just regarding the Dalian Codex translation documents. We will be in camera for about 15 minutes to discuss that. So when you get it today, it'll be regarding Wednesday. If there's nothing else, we are adjourned. Sure.